Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining the Home in Tacoma meeting. My name is Heidi Agler, and I am a consultant to the city who has helped them estimate their affordable housing needs over the last 6 months, and I will be helping to facilitate this evening. Thank you so much for your interest and participation. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The first is, as you heard, this meeting is being recorded, and it will be published as an official meeting record. That also means that the Q&A, where you have the ability to ask questions, will also be being recorded and will be available to the public, just as if we were in a public meeting and notes were being taken or transcripts were being taken. We do have the ability for interpretation, for Spanish interpretation, and so for anyone who needs Spanish interpretation, I'm going to let our interpreter tell you how to join that room. If you are familiar with that, you can hit the interpretation button that's on your Zoom screen, and that will automatically take you into that room. Margaret, did you want to provide any additional information?
Para intérprete en español, presione el botón Interpretation.
Great, thank you very much. So again, those of you who have just joined, we have a rotating slideshow that we are walking through now as people are gathering into the meeting room. We'll get started in just a moment, but I just wanted to remind folks that this meeting's being recorded. The Q&A are also being recorded or transcribed, and there is Spanish interpretation available for anybody who needs it. We're going to jump in though and do a little bit of a poll. I do want to let folks know that this poll is just simply an icebreaker. So we're not recording any information that will be used to officially inform the plan. We just want to get a sense of your perspectives on this project, any concerns that you might have, and get a sense of what questions you would like answered as we go throughout this process. Some folks have already put questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much. As we go throughout the process, your ability to ask questions that we will answer after the presentation, that will happen in the Q&A. So if you have questions, rather than raise your hand, type those in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that those questions are responded to as we get to that portion of the presentation. But for our icebreaker, for those of you who are using this on the Zoom screen, you should see a fun poll pop up. Go ahead and fill in responses to these questions, and then I'll let folks know what we're seeing in the poll in just a moment. So for those of you who are just joining, we've got a poll that's active right now. This is just a fun way to get a sense of your concerns, the questions that you may have about this project. It's not an official public record. It's just really for fun and to gather information about what you'd like answered as we go throughout this meeting this evening. As folks are gathering, the other thing that I would invite you to do, and I'm going to add this to the Q&A right now, is to visit the website. We have a really wonderful website that's been developed for this project. It's got a fun video. It's got a lot of information about all the research that was done to inform the project. It is, you can actually Google just Home in Tacoma. It'll take you right to that website that will provide you not only information in a number of languages about the project, but it'll also give you some information about the City Council public hearing that's coming up next week, July 13th, about the Home in Tacoma project. So Mary, do we have enough responses to the poll that you think you'd like to share any of those? We have some active people participating in the poll at this point.
We have about 50% of the people attending have voted. If you'd like me to share those now.
Yeah, let's go ahead and see what people said. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm staring at a poll on the other side of my screen. I apologize. So just a brief recap on what we're seeing in the poll. The first question is the benefits of infill housing. The top, a number of people preferred not to answer, didn't feel like they were convinced that there were benefits. Those that did perceive benefits said that infill housing can create jobs and support local businesses and reduce car dependency in walkable neighborhoods. There was a question about concerns about infill housing. The top concerns were infill housing compromising green spaces, yards, tree canopy, that those spaces that are very valued could be lost. Other top concerns, new houses being taller or closer together, or design of new houses might not fit the character. And then our third question was really about what you want to hear about tonight. What questions do you have about mid-scale residential proposals? This meeting, unlike Tuesday's meeting will focus a little more heavily on mid-scale residential proposals. We'll define those in the presentation too. I see somebody's asked about what is infill housing in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we answer that as we walk through the presentation. But when we look at the top concerns that folks have, boy, design controls are really kind of far and above. I also see transition between lower and higher scales in thinking about mid-scale housing, as well as trees and open space, which we saw earlier. Preservation of green space is a concern. So thanks everybody for taking that poll. I'm going to go ahead, we'll go ahead and get started. A couple new people joined, so just a few housekeeping items very, very quickly. This meeting is being recorded and it will be available on the website. The website is, you can Google City of Tacoma, Home in Tacoma Project, and you will find the website with lots of information. There is a City Council public hearing on July 13th. That's next Tuesday. That's at 5:15 p.m., no earlier than 5:15 p.m. If you want to make comments leading up to that meeting, you need to submit those to the city clerk before 4 p.m. on the 13th. All of that information is on the website. It's really easy to find. The Q&A. So some folks are pretty familiar with this process and have already put some questions or some opinions in the Q&A. That is how we will be taking comments and questions throughout this evening. So feel free to populate those. My job as facilitator is to monitor those. We probably will not have enough time for me to ask every single question individually to our panelists. So I'll aggregate those and ask them in a broader fashion to the panelists. We are, and the city staff are working on an FAQ, so a method to respond to the questions that are more detailed, that are more technical, and that we don't get a chance to respond to, the panelists don't get a chance to respond to this evening. So don't worry if we don't ask your specific question, it will get answered. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to our presenters. But first, I'd like to introduce those presenters. We have with us tonight Jacques Colon, Eliot Barnett, and Commissioner Torres, who's a Planning Commission member. Jacques, do you want to go ahead and introduce?
Yes, thank you, Heidi. So my name is Jacques Colon. I'm the Tacoma 2025 Strategic Manager for the city. And in that role, I am responsible for helping the implementation of Tacoma 2025, which is the city's strategic plan that was developed by Tacoma citizens. And for those of you that may not be familiar, it was developed with the consultation of more than 2,000 Tacoma residents. So it really was a community-driven strategic plan. And the reason why we're starting off with that is one of the key goals in Tacoma 2025 is that more Tacoma residents will be able to afford to live in Tacoma, to have housing in Tacoma, and transportation for less than 40% of their income. And we know that that's one of the key challenges that we're facing in the city right now, because every time that we engage with the city about anything, you as a city, the residents always tell us that affordable housing, housing affordability, homelessness, that these are some of the key issues in the city today. So we know how high of a priority this is to the community. And so with that in mind, the city has an affordable housing action strategy that really lays out how we will take different actions to help achieve that objective within Tacoma 2025. And what we're going to be talking to you about today is one of the really key actions that's laid out in the Affordable Housing Action Strategy, which is to create more diverse housing types that allow for different income levels and different lifestyles to live in Tacoma. And so as we get started on that, Eliot's going to bring up the presentation, and I'm going to share with my co-presenters, Commissioner Torres and Eliot, in a few minutes. Before I do that, I just wanted to briefly say that we know that there is a broad spectrum of opinions about this proposal. And that's great. That's what civic engagement is really all about, is taking all of the different interests and needs in a community and figuring out what are the solutions that can maximize the benefit and minimize the negative impacts. And our city council has asked us as staff and our planning commission to bring forward solutions to the housing crisis that we're experiencing today. And I'll speak a little bit more about that crisis, that include tools that would use city money, tools that would use city land, and as we're going to talk about in Home in Tacoma, use city policies like zoning policies to help create additional housing that helps meet our housing crisis needs. So tonight, I want to be clear that we are going to give you as much information as we can about the proposal as it exists today, because it is a constantly evolving proposal, as you'll hear more from Commissioner Torres about. But we want to share with you as much information as possible, and particularly from the staff side, share with you why the proposal is what it is. What are the problems that we are trying to solve, and why do we think that it will solve those problems? And that's not because we're trying to convince anybody to believe the same things we believe. In fact, we want to hear those concerns, because those concerns are what help us, iron out what will make it the most, maximize benefit and minimize negative impact. So we certainly do want to still hear those concerns and talk through those. But I did want to be clear that staff and our role is to share as much information as possible, including what we think the benefits might be, in order so that you can give the most informed public comment to council on next week's July 13th council public comment period. So with that, let's start the presentation. And as Heidi mentioned, as we're giving you this presentation, please start putting your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen so that we can get to those as best we can. So before we get into the proposal itself, I just mentioned what some of our meeting objectives are. And just to reiterate, we really want to help you prepare to give the best comments possible to council through July 13th. And it's through July 13th because you can provide those comments in written form before July 13th, or you can come to the public hearing and provide them at that time. On the next slide, I mentioned that we are going to have the public hearing next week on July 13th. This is not something that is coming out of the blue. This is the result of a long series of steps and decisions, most recently completed by the Planning Commission submitting their recommendations to Council on May 19th, and Tacoma residents receiving notification and engagement in June and July. After the public hearing next week, Council is going to be coming back together for a committee of the whole, which is just what they call a special council study session with all of the council members. And that's going to set off a council committee review period from July to September, where council is really going to be thinking about all of the input that they hear, including that at the public hearing, and formulating what they would like to change in order to create their final proposal for council action, which they'll be taking to full council sometime in the fall. All of this, Eliot will talk more about this, but all of this is within the scope of what is called phase 1 of Home in Tacoma, which is really simply setting the vision of what could be our new growth strategy. So it's not making any formal changes to zoning or rules as of yet. It's simply setting a vision to create more units of housing by using some of the tools for low scale and mid scale housing that we'll be talking about. Phase 2 is going to have a timeline that will be longer, sometime in 2022 and the end of 2021, if council does choose to move forward with an affirmative to phase 1 of the Home in Tacoma at their fall 2021 council action time. And phase 2 is when you're going to see a lot of the more particular details of this proposal ironed out, including specific zoning changes, design review standards and what those look like, including how design review standards will look different in different neighborhoods to respond to specific neighborhood character, and other specifics such as that. So for those of you that are really interested in those details, we will be getting there, and there will be a lot of opportunity for more engagement around those details. But today's conversation really is focused on phase 1 and the vision of Tacoma's growth strategy. So the Home in Tacoma project is really intended to support housing supply, choice, and affordability. And I'm gonna go through that really quickly so you understand what we mean by that. So when we say support housing supply, this is one way that we believe that we can take action to increase the number of housing units that are created in the city of Tacoma. And that's housing supply, is the number of units. We also think that this is a strategy that can help increase or support housing choice, which means different types of housing to support different needs, lifestyles, etc. So for example, different square footages than you would normally find in a typical single family house. So smaller units for households with only 1 or 2 people, as an example. And then also, we think that this proposal can help support housing affordability because, just briefly, many of us know that we have an affordable housing crisis, which means we don't have enough housing that meets the needs of our lowest income residents, those that are making less money than, let's say, 50% of the area median income. There is an affordable housing crunch right now and a crisis, but there's also a housing affordability crisis across more economic levels than just the lowest income. And we're seeing that in terms of the rapid increases in home prices, the rapid increases in rents, and those increases in comparison to job losses and relatively low increases in wages. So we know that housing affordability is not something that is only being felt by our lowest income residents. In fact, the crisis is expanding in scope to being felt by people who can no longer think about getting into the housing market because home prices are too high, or people who can no longer afford to rent close to their where they live, learn, or work. And so this is really a challenge across both supply, choice, and affordability. So that's what we mean by those words. And I mentioned that we have an affordable housing action strategy to try to talk about all of the ways that we can take action on this housing affordability crisis. And those objectives are broken up into 4 main areas: creating more homes for more people, which is where we're going to focus most of our discussion today, because the Home in Tacoma project really, again, is aimed at supporting housing supply, choice, and affordability through creating more homes for more people. But at the same time, it's not the silver bullet that will solve all of the problems of our housing affordability crisis. And so in addition to that, we are going to have to do other things to increase the number of units to keep up with our population needs, while at the same time keeping housing that already exists as affordable housing, affordable and in good repair, helping people staying in their homes and in their communities, while at the same time reducing barriers for people who often encounter them. So for those of you that are interested in how these many different actions and objectives play out together to help us try to achieve better housing outcomes for Tacoma, I would invite you to go online and look at the Affordable Housing Action Strategy. But for today's conversation, we really are going to focus in on creating more homes for more people with the Home in Tacoma proposal. And when we talk about what the housing affordability need is, I just want to point you to that data point on the left that says 40% of Tacoma households are cost burdened. And that means that 40% of households in Tacoma are paying a higher percentage of their income towards their housing needs than is recognized that should be in order for them to be able to pay for all of the other needs that they have, like childcare, food, medicine, etc. And so you see in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a little explanation of what cost burdened and severely cost burdened look like. So in addition to the housing affordability goals that I mentioned, we also know that housing meets multiple goals within Tacoma 2025, such as walkable and livable neighborhoods, workforce housing for folks such as nurses, grocery store workers, teachers, etc. It allows for more opportunity for our elder Tacoma residents to age in place and stay in the communities that they have grown to love and become such an integral part of, as well as creating access to opportunity for more Tacoma residents, additional paths to financial stability through home ownership, and recognizing that cities are the right place for growth. When we think about how our population growth is going to look across Pierce County, Tacoma is well positioned to not just accept that growth, but to really think about ways to plan for that growth smartly so that our neighborhoods continue to thrive with that growth. And the last thing I'll say about housing affordability is, for those of you that may not understand how these potential zoning changes might affect affordability, we'll talk more, Eliot will talk you through more of what the proposals look like, but I'd like you to imagine all of the costs that developers face when they are building a unit of housing. There's the costs of land, the costs of construction materials, the costs of labor, etc. And that's not even getting into the city costs like permitting that we're trying to address through things like our Permit Advisory Task Force. But the Home in Tacoma Project, our theory of change that this can help address affordability is that if a developer can take the same amount of land and roughly the same amount of construction materials and create a building envelope that looks roughly the same as the other buildings that are in a neighborhood, but instead of using that as one unit, splitting it into two smaller units for people that might be in a place in their life or their pathway to home ownership where that would make more sense for them, then you can potentially limit the costs to the development side, which would limit the costs of that unit ultimately when it's sold. So that's why we talk about this project having an impact on affordability, because it really does have the potential to increase the flexibility and choice for the types of units and what that means for cost. So quickly moving forward, missing middle housing will help, but again, it's not the only thing that's going to solve our affordability challenges. So there are a number of different ways that we need to address the housing crisis, and this is one way that we think can be helpful in doing that. But there are additional actions. You can see some of them here, such as affordability incentives, looking at inclusionary zoning in some places that can support that with strong markets, looking at other anti-displacement strategies, and really, again, the full range of affordable housing action strategy actions. So that's the rationale and the thinking behind what's the problem that we're seeking to solve, or what are some of the problems that we're seeking to address with this proposal. Next slide, please. So with that, thank you all. I'll stick around to help with questions and the Q&A period, but I'm going to pass it to Commissioner Torres. Thank you so much for walking folks through some of the thinking of the Planning Commission, Commissioner Torres.
Yeah, of course. And before I get started on the slides, I just want to take a second to introduce myself. I know we have a lot of viewers here that might not be familiar with the Planning Commission as a whole, and much less me as an individual. My name is Alyssa Torres. I serve on the Planning Commission as a volunteer community member. And I represent District 4, which is over in the east side. And I bought my home here on the east side in 2017. And currently it houses 3 adults, including a shared housing services tenant and a family member. My older brother moved in with me last year, as well as 2 dogs, 3 cats, and 3 chickens. So we got a full house over here on the east side. And I've served on the Planning Commission for about 2 years. I joined right after I graduated from UW-T, their master's program of community planning. And I currently work for the Tacoma Housing Authority in real estate development, where we work to acquire and build affordable housing for Tacoma residents. And I know it's longer than a typical introduction might be, but I really wanted to let everyone know kind of who we are as a commission and who we are as individuals who are working on this policy that also affects us as homeowners, as community members, and that are really trying to make the city livable for everyone. So with that, I'm going to go over some of the points here on the next couple of slides as it pertains to our role in putting this together. So Tacoma's growth vision, we're really trying to accommodate the growth that Tacoma is seeing. As we know, people are moving here. We have a population that's aging here, and we'd like to stay here, right? So 75% of our current city land is zoned for single family housing, which can be prohibitive to account for all that growth that's happening. So this picture that you're looking at now is what the current zoning looks like. That indicates that 75% single family zone. And that really prohibits us from doing some of the infill that we're talking about, and allowing some different types of housing to be built to accommodate more people that want different types of housing. And then this slide very conveniently shows some of those types of housing. So one of the questions that we get is, what is missing middle housing? And this is that shows some of the really diverse types of missing middle housing, this mid-scale that we hope this type of policy will encourage to be built. And as you see in this image, it's a lot of different types of things, from duplexes and cottages to the more kind of typical mid-scale you think of. But we wanted to show that there are different options within this missing middle. It's not just a big box that's going to be dropped in a neighborhood. Really, there are really different types of housing that are under this missing middle umbrella, and that will increase our housing stock and allow people to live in different diverse areas, and really encourage walkable neighborhoods. So you can live in a place and be able to walk and get all of your stuff that you need in the same neighborhood. And then on the next slide, we will go into kind of our community engagement efforts. And if you saw in some of the slides during the kind of intro part, we kind of indicated some of the work that we've been doing as the Planning Commission and as the staff to get this information out in front of people, to inform the residents of some of the potential changes that are coming, and to get feedback. So city staff has done a really great job. And as a community engagement practitioner myself, I've been really proud of the work that the city staff has done, going out to community meetings, doing presentations, especially during a time when we weren't allowed to be in person, making the effort to do lots of virtual meetings, mailings, emails, and we've gotten a lot of feedback so far, including thousands of comments at virtual cafes and other public hearings that we've done, lots of emails, lots of conversations with different community groups. So it's been a big push for this for the last year. And these are some of the things that we've heard from the information sessions that we've been doing, and we've heard from you all as a community that we are experiencing this crisis. There is a broad support for affordability tools, and there are some concerns that go along with that. And on the next slide, we'll show you kind of how we have taken what we've heard from all of this really robust community engagement and really integrated that into the plan as it has been today. Like was mentioned earlier, this plan has seen a lot of different iterations. You started as one thing, we heard feedback, we went back to the drawing board, we switched things around, and we really wanted to make sure that we were including things that we were hearing into this plan and making sure that the community is going to be comfortable with it as much as we can, right? Because it's change, and people are we're going to sometimes grapple with the uncertainties of change. But we want to make sure that we're incorporating those concerns and addressing those. So you can see some of the things that came up. The amount of mid-scale has been reduced from one of the initial plans that we had, and also just the scale of it. So we had been thinking of more like a 4 or 5 story in the mid-scale, and we reduced it to 2 or 3 stories. So we're really taking those things into consideration. And also what we're doing here tonight is also as a result of some of the things that we heard from the community, as far as slowing down the process just a little bit to make sure that we are presenting as much information as possible, and providing opportunities for our community members to really understand what's happening. So that is some of the stuff from the commission's standpoint. Looking forward to getting into some of the Q&A and having this opportunity to interface with everyone.
All right, thank you so much, Commissioner Torres, Jacques, and Heidi. Hi, everybody. I'm Eliot Barnett. I'm a planner. You may have heard me presenting on this before. If so, welcome back, and thank you for your patience with my presentations. First, just a really quick introduction following after Commissioner Torres and Jacques. I've been a planner with Tacoma for about 15 years, and my current focus is on housing. As part of that, we really focus on a well-rounded strategy. We are working on managing growth that we know is coming to the city. We're working on trying to meet our environmental goals, working on economic development, working on design, all these different things that you see integrated and weaved into the Home in Tacoma project. And then a real core principle there is to do our very best to give you and to give everybody in the community the opportunity to understand and to have meaningful input on these proposals. So I appreciate your patience. I am going to get into some of the details and try to answer some of the questions here. And because it's kind of a little one way from us to you right now, I'm going to just kind of talk at you for a little bit here. I'm trying to answer some of those questions that I think you have. But then after that, Heidi will give us some of your additional questions. This has been, I think, pretty clear from Jacques and Commissioner Torres. This is a multi-phase effort here with the Home in Tacoma project. It's looking at changing the vision and policies right now. And my neighbors just turned on their lawnmower. I hope it's not distracting. I'll just keep going here. So it's changing the policy framework. It's not eliminating single-family houses. It's moving away from exclusive single-family housing rules, shifting that to scale and design as the organizing principle of our housing rules for residential areas. It does also designate mid-scale housing areas near shopping and transit, but it's an only if package that the commission has put together. What I mean is the zoning changes should be put in place only if and when the city council is satisfied that the design and standards are solid and they're what they need to be. And along with that, the policies recommend strengthening our toolkit for affordable housing and a range of different policies to promote equity, anti-racism, and anti-displacement has been a really big theme of this effort too. So phase 2 would be initiated by council action on this first phase. And that, like Jacques said, would be where the details would be worked out. So it would be implementing whatever the final vision and policies are adopted by council through specific zoning changes, through the development of design standards, and then through a range of different actions that we know are very important to supporting any kind of development, and certainly for infill housing. And that's infrastructure and services, figuring out parking and transportation choices. A big concern from day one, reducing the potential demolition of viable structures, a big part of the policies that are recommended here. Working on our sustainability goals, our resilient housing, trying to do what we can to create housing that is physically accessible for people who have different abilities. And then working on things like city permitting and education and technical support, which are also just as important as the zoning and the rules themselves. It's how the city supports that. So phase 2 would be coming most likely, the beginning of next calendar year. and would be its own robust process where we would invite you to sign up now and participate in, give input to any and all of those conversations that we'll be having. I wanted to, focus in a little bit on how growth has been taking place over recent years. So these are a couple of graphics that show where the majority of our recent housing development has been. And it's actually been in our designated centers, primarily downtown, as well as the 16 other designated centers around the city. And one thing that's a little confusing when we talk about missing middle and residential areas, we're not proposing to divert all that growth from the centers and from downtown. That would still be the place where most growth occurs over time. And so what we're doing is proposing to just increase the range of choices so that not, as you can see in this graphic, the majority of recent development has been multifamily apartments. And so if we adopt these proposals, you would likely see a broader range. You'd still see those big buildings downtown, but you would also see small and medium buildings throughout the city's neighborhoods. So as you may know, the proposal is to change our current single family exclusive zoning or land use categories to low scale and mid scale. So these graphics, which you may have seen before, first this one shows what low scale, what we mean by that. The basic idea is house size, house shape. But within that envelope, you may have more than one dwelling unit. So the buildings or the sites that you see on this graphic where you see some color added in, that indicates that those are missing middle infill housing, which could be 2, 3, 4 or more units, but still basically the size and shape of houses. The medium scale or mid scale is the upper end of missing middle housing, depicted here in this graphic, kind of from the middle off to the right, where you see these medium and slightly larger buildings. The idea there is that in some cases where the location is close to shopping, close to transit, et cetera, it has a lot of benefits to create more housing units where more people can take advantage of walking and can be close to the things they need in daily life. So good for affordability, good for access to all kinds of opportunities. So as you know, there is a recommended housing growth scenarios map. I'm going to show you in just a minute how that map was created, how the commission worked on that over time. Was they started by saying, okay, where are the areas where we have rich opportunities for people to have a walkable, transit-supported lifestyle? And that's our centers and our designated corridors, as well as transit routes. And over here on the right, you can see a map that shows those areas, either as lines for the corridors and transit lines, or as polygon shapes for those centers. And so the decision was, those are areas where there's a high opportunity to create more walkable urban housing supply. And that became the basis for where the mid-scale residential proposal was considered. The commission worked on a couple of initial scenarios that you may have seen back in February and March. And they were evolve housing choices and transform housing choices. Both of them, they do both include a shift away from exclusive single family. So the yellow color is becoming low scale, where you'd have a range of lower scale housing types. The pink color would be becoming mid-scale, where you'd have the larger end of missing middle housing types allowed. So the commission got lots and lots of comments, maybe from some of you on those two, and really went through several different iterations and finally came back with a final recommended housing growth scenario. And this is what you see on the map here. A few things to know about it. One, the commission wanted to follow streets and natural barriers, and things like freeways and steep slopes and things like that. And so as you look at this map online, and there's an interactive map on the webpage, you'll see the lines are not all just straight set distance from a center or corridor. They try to follow streets whenever possible. There are a couple details about the map that are good to know. There were some Some parks that are current land use map were shown as multifamily, even though they're parks, nobody wants to build housing there. So those are kind of some cleanups that happened on the map as well. You may see those and have some questions. At the end of the day, the current neighborhoods are about 90% single family and 10% multifamily today. So in this proposed map, it's about 60-40. So it's still mostly the lower scale and about 40% mid-scale. So certainly a significant increase in the areas where you could do a range of housing types up to a mid-scale of multifamily. So this picture shows, gives you one way of thinking about the different housing types that would be allowed in the low and the mid-scale. And on the left, it starts with houses. First of all, houses would be allowed everywhere. And in fact, we'd be creating more space for smaller houses, whereas our neighborhoods are largely built out under our current rules. There would be more opportunities for small infill houses or small lot houses. Houses with accessory dwelling units, some more opportunities would be created there. Duplexes and triplexes or attached 2 or 3 units together, or cottage housing, which is several small houses clustered around a common shared open space. So that's low scale housing that would be allowed generally in the yellow areas on the map. In certain cases in that low scale area, there would be fourplexes or small multifamily. And those areas are defined in the policies right now as sort of on the transition where you're getting close to the mid-scale areas where you're on a big corridor, or perhaps where you have an extra large piece of land, where it might make sense with some special review to do a fourplex or a small multifamily. And lastly, the mid-scale, this is where you would see still, low rise, mostly 3 stories, but perhaps a larger structure along the street and a larger number of units could be built in a medium multifamily, as you see on the right-hand side over here. So the proposal comes with a strong statement about the design, because we know that design and how these structures would be built is absolutely critical. In fact, that's the core of the proposal, is to shift from saying the number of units are what's critical to saying it's really the design and the scale that are critical. So the proposal includes these missing middle housing design and scale principles, and it's all about pedestrian orientation, having the massing and the size or scale of the buildings to be consistent with the neighborhood around it, using design compatible design language or residential patterns to have the new buildings fit in with the buildings around it, working very hard on transitions between lower and higher scale areas. There's all sorts of design techniques that can reduce the overall appearance of how big or how dense a project is. Integrating shared spaces, tucking the cars away as much as possible, and then encouraging the reuse of existing structures. The proposal really emphasizes that it would be better to reuse a structure and perhaps convert it from a house to 2 or 3 units or some other number of units, but to keep the existing structure when possible. So those are the policies or the principles that would govern design standards. The Commission's recommendations also talk about looking neighborhood by neighborhood, because not all neighborhoods are the same across the city. And on the left-hand side, you see a map that's in our plans now that kind of recognizes that we have our older inner areas that were built, 100 years ago or thereabouts, all the way out to our much more recent neighborhoods that have been built in a different era. And so the proposal says study the design principles for each of those areas, study the scale of the buildings of each of those areas, and have those be the foundation for the design standards that would come forward. So residential patterns, this is kind of just an illustration of what we mean there. So here you see probably a duplex or a triplex, an image of one. Well, the idea is that the number of units is really not the critical thing here. It's really that it's got a front yard and street trees, walkways to the front doors, backyards, separation between the buildings, etc., that those are the things that really make it fit in with the neighborhood around it. So here you see a larger structure. This would be a medium multifamily that would be potentially allowed in that mid-scale area on the map. It's a larger structure, absolutely. So it does reflect a larger scale. That being said, it still has the yards and the separation and the trees, and it has the cars, the parking tucked in the back, etc. That those are the residential patterns that this proposal places a huge importance on. So just to give some visuals for what would be incompatible with these proposals, because that's just as important as what is compatible here. So here you see a few examples that I've just photographed over the last year. And these examples are not consistent with those design principles for a few reasons. Either they have that lack of a pedestrian orientation, or they're really overshadowing the existing house next to them, too close up to the street, not continuing those residential patterns. Or they're just out of scale with the neighborhood around them. So on the right-hand side, you see a 4-story building. That would be the very largest structure that could be considered in this proposal. And in this particular instance, it would not be consistent because the proposal calls for avoiding those abrupt transitions, such as a 1 to 4 stories, one-story structure, then having a 4-story structure go in next to it. So that's what incompatible looks like. We've developed some graphics here that we'll be working with more in the future. So what is a compatible scale transition? So here you see the different housing types that we've been talking about shown integrated in next to houses, 1 or 2-story structures. And the new structures are not that much larger. They continue the rhythm of the street in terms of the massing of structures, kind of mimicking that of houses. They have the yards and those sort of types of features. So the proposal says this type of development would be in scale and could be considered compatible with our existing neighborhoods. So got a couple of pictures here. One of the comments from Tuesday were that people wanted to see real life examples of some of this stuff. So this is a neighborhood I happened to visit recently, happens to be actually in Missoula, Montana. But I thought it was a good illustration of a scale transition. So here on the top, you see that you have an old single family neighborhood, but as you move towards the left, you can see that there's some new structures that have gone in. Those are actually, some of those are attached duplexes or triplexes as you move on towards the left, but they continue the basic kind of residential patterns of the neighborhood. And as you move further on towards the left, you can see in the distance that there's a block that's about 4 stories tall. And then finally, you get down to your core where you have big buildings that are about 6 stories tall. And the bottom image that I've got here is that transition point between the lower scale and a mid scale. This is an example of another city kind of drawing that transition. And they also use the street to establish that transition line. So Tacoma's standards could ultimately work something like this. And this would be an example of, on the left-hand side, where you might see a 3-story structure or potentially up to a 4-story structure, if that is where the council decides to go, and really only next to big things, like next to the big buildings far off in the distance over here. So I hope those make it a little more real for people. Last couple slides I have here before going into questions. The idea is not to replace our existing houses, but instead to just integrate in some additional structures over time. So here you see a before and after. So at the end of the day, 30 years in the future or something like that, the vision is really that the neighborhood would very much be familiar to someone from today, but there would be some new structures integrated in that are a little bit bigger. There would definitely be more homes on that same block for the number of people, or as compared to the people who can live there today. And then in the mid scale, the change would be a little bit more. There would definitely be this idea of some medium-sized structures like you see here in this example. But even so, we're not talking about covering the whole lot with structure, really talking about structures that could have been built into the neighborhood even from day one, and still continue those patterns that really define the neighborhood. So I hope that those images try to give a little answer to what is especially mid-scale residential, since that's our focus for tonight. And last thing, just the nuts and bolts. If you look on the webpage, you'll see several documents. The Housing Action Plan, I really recommend it if you're curious about the market considerations for why we think this will work and why we think it'll help with affordability. That's really well defined in that, or captured in the Housing Action Plan. The comp plan policy changes, those are the actual policies that will then guide the development of zoning and standards. So those are really important. There are some near-term code changes in the package that really just can make our current zoning and our current tools a little bit more streamlined for things like accessory dwelling units and create some more affordable housing bonuses. The SEPA determination captures the analysis that the city has done of infrastructure, environment, and other kinds of impacts that do come with development, but they recommend the actions that are needed in order to handle those moving forward. And last thing about infrastructure I want to just say is that that SEPA determination does say, look closely at infrastructure and basically only do the zoning if and when we can figure out how to support any new housing that gets built with infrastructure and services, because that's a bedrock, that's a baseline requirement that would be absolutely part of this proposal. So I will stop talking. I never know if I've gone too long in these Zoom meetings, so I apologize if I have. But again, here are the critical details. The date to remember is next Tuesday, July 13th, by 4 p.m. for your written comments, and starting no earlier than 5:15 if you are willing to come and testify to the City Council. I know that really means a lot to the council members to hear directly from you in those meetings.
Hey, Eliot, this is Heidi. Before you stop sharing your PowerPoint potentially, I'm wondering, there are a couple questions about design and the definition between low scale, or the differences between low scale and mid scale. And I'm wondering if you can go to, which I think is slide 19, because I think it would be a nice visual as we talk through this first question that I have from attendees. So it's the missing middle, exactly that one. So there were a number of questions that concerned design, as well as some that were a little more technical in terms of actual definition of low scale and mid scale. One question was sort of apartment buildings that are larger than fourplexes. Are those would those be considered low scale? Yeah,
good question. The current policies, as the City Council is looking at them today, those would primarily be in the mid scale. But there is the opportunity to look at what we define here as the small multifamily, and that's in that low scale housing in some circumstances category. So what the proposal says is that even in the low scale, if you have a large lot, or if you're right across the street from a dense area, and through a special review process, like a conditional use permit, that a larger number of units could potentially be proposed. So that is part of the low scale currently. We don't know whether council will modify that or not moving forward.
And then is there a units per acre like definition of low scale or mid scale?
No, there is not. The units per acre is not the basis of this. Really, the starting point was to look at the scale and design, and really just say that that's what's really important. So long as the city can provide the infrastructure, as long as we can make it work in terms of the nuts and bolts. Beyond that, the critical thing is just continuing the residential patterns and being consistent with or at least compatible with the existing scale of the neighborhood.
Great. So there are a number of questions about, just or concerns, I would say, about making sure that these new housing types would fit in well with neighborhoods that would reflect the character of neighborhoods. And I think what this slide here shows maybe the intent of how design would achieve that. The other questions that are associated with design, but were more sort of parking and traffic oriented. It's hard sometimes to see with these pictures where cars might go or where there's an opportunity, where garages are required. So could you speak to parking and accommodation and sort of how this plan's thought about that?
Sure. I'll just choose this image here to talk about that, since we are focusing on mid-scale, so the largest sort of size or scale of structure here. So as you can see, if you look closely, parking's at the rear of the site. For a long time now, Tacoma has had policies and standards that try whenever possible to locate the cars behind the structure, and that's in order to try to have a more pedestrian-oriented, streetscape. The question may also be wondering, or the person may be wondering about the number of parking spaces that would be required. That has not been determined yet. The city. The package does call for a review of parking as part of this effort to figure out what the right balance is, because parking drives up the cost of development. That being said, parking out on the street is an impact to the neighborhood. And so policy conversation that would need to be had as part of that phase 2 would be not the location of parking. That's definitely going to be tucked away and towards the rear of the site whenever feasible, but the amount of parking that would be required.
And another thing about parking too, because this comes up a lot in all of our community engagement efforts and information sessions is parking. And the reason why the spaces that we've chosen for this infill to happen around centers and corridors is because of its proximity to transit lines. And so we have a great commissioner, Chris Carnes, who is the expert in all things transit, who has really helped us decide where this infill is going to happen, making sure it is within a walkable distance to those corridors and to where public transit is accessible, and hoping, what is it, a 1/8 of a mile, Eliot, to make sure that any of these new buildings will have access to transit. So we're trying to reduce, car dependency, just because we know, it's negative impacts on our environment. Parking does cost a lot, and it doesn't provide any environmental benefits. So it's something that we've fine-tuned as we have worked on this proposal over the last several months. And it's something, especially around parking, that we want to make sure that we're encouraging walkability for neighborhoods and encouraging public transportation as well.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. I'm going to tick off a couple of, I think, which are relatively easier comments, and then I just want to acknowledge that there's a number of really technical comments. So people are asking questions about like the lot adjacent to their neighborhood, or what might happen in their kind of the surrounding area. I believe, and Eliot, correct me if I'm wrong, but some of those more, kind of detailed comments that staff could respond to those, sort of those technical details as part of the FAQ. But one comment was about whether or not, so sort of logistically, whether or not, if somebody put a comment in the Q&A, is that going to be forwarded to City Council before the City Council meeting, or would they need to provide a separate comment in advance of that meeting?
Okay, yeah, great questions. The second question first, send your comments to City Council, absolutely. Of course, we will provide, overviews of these discussions and the questions that have come up. However, it's only a few days away, and the purpose of this meeting is just to really give you the information so you can decide what your comments to council will be. So that's part of it. In terms of that FAQ, we will do our best. If you have really technical questions, sometimes the answer is probably going to be, we don't know yet, because this policy, or this is at the policy level right now. So much to be determined. We can't tell you the number of parking stalls or the exact, setbacks or anything like that yet. And neither can, the council hasn't decided all those things quite yet either. It's more at the stage of deciding the direction at a higher level. And if that's the direction, then all of those things need to be worked on. I thought I'd manage people's expectations. We'll do our best to answer specific questions, but we may not be able to in that regard.
Great, thank you, Eliot. So another, which I think is a relatively easy question, is when might this go into effect? So a property owner wanted to know, when would I be able to make changes to my property if I wanted to?
Great question. The first thing to know is not right away. So even if council were to adopt the package exactly as it is now, this is still just policies, and so we need to develop the zoning and standards. We estimate that would likely take, about a year, yet to be determined by the city council in terms of, what schedule they want to pursue. So it's not going to be tomorrow. And also looking at other cities that have put this kind of change in place, they often build in some kind of review or implementation time even after the zoning is developed. One example is the city of Portland. They changed their zoning code, and I think there was 6 months or longer at least before the zoning was actually in place. So it's going to be a year or two, I would say.
Great.
If not longer.
Thanks, Eliot. There's a question about geography, a number of questions actually about geography and the parts of the city that could be affected. So some of those questions range from commenters feeling like their neighborhood's getting a lot of activity, there are a lot of luxury developments going in, and they feel like it's not shared, that kind of development's not shared throughout the city. Others are wondering about historic districts, and would those historic districts or contributing districts be immune from this, or would development be allowed to occur within those districts? So can you speak, since you've got the map up here too, a little more about geography and areas where this might not apply, or where the city anticipates that development could be more active?
Sure, and I'll just keep going, but Commissioner Torres, jump in anywhere that you want to address this stuff. But I'll say, first, addressing historic districts, as you'll see, they are included in this concept here. And that was something that the Planning Commission thought about a lot, and we consulted with the Landmarks Preservation Commission on as well. So many older neighborhoods already demonstrate a mix of housing types, and that was a factor. The current zoning actually does not allow the development patterns that were originally built there historically. So in one way, this is moving back toward more consistency with the development patterns that are there today. That being said, they also have very valuable existing structures and existing character, and so there's an even stronger emphasis in the package on reducing the likelihood as strongly as possible of demolitions of historical structures, and instead trying to promote reuse of existing structures. So that might mean a historic house turns into a duplex or triplex or something else over time. So that's going to be a big priority in phase 2. In terms of the neighborhoods of the city and whether this, there are different development patterns or different pace of development happening throughout the city, we definitely recognize that. There's certainly places where development's happening faster than others. The overall approach here is that it would be a citywide housing, or a change to the housing strategy, and that's because in the past, cities have often kind of put the higher density zoning kind of over there, and that isn't always an equitable approach. It also creates less housing in areas that have a lot of opportunities that can be beneficial to people who have, to everybody, but where it's difficult for people with lower incomes to live today. So we recognize that there's a different pace of development going, but I think the approach as it stands is citywide, and wants to come up with design standards that address the different issues that may exist throughout the city by looking at existing neighborhood patterns, historic districts, and all those other things that could be tailored in phase 2.
Great, thank
Yeah,
you.
can I jump in really quickly?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I think the point, Eliot, that you made about equity, one of the things we did as part of this process on the Planning Commission was to look at the City of Tacoma's equity index, and to really look at where those places were that had higher. And I was it in this presentation? I've seen it so often. I'm like, it's like ingrained in my head. But looking at those areas where the opportunities are higher, and making sure that we are allowing density in those places to allow more Tacoma residents to also receive those benefits. And then if you look at this map too, you see the red areas that are pretty, evenly distributed throughout the city. So we're really wanting and hoping that the development in this infill really happens equitably around the city, so that one neighborhood isn't overburdened with a lot of developments at one time, or a lot of construction, or negative impacts that they could feel, but that hopefully it's really distributed evenly throughout our neighborhoods, even all the way up into Northwest Tacoma or Northeast Tacoma. So that goes back to why we kind of chose the centers and the corridors, because it does span our entire city pretty well and covers all of our districts. And we really wanted to make sure that we were addressing that as equitably as possible.
Great, and Commissioner Torres, while we have you on here, or at least you're on in my small window in my screen.
Yeah.
There are a number of questions, actually on Tuesday and tonight as well, about as the commissioners were considering these proposals over the last 6 months or so. Could you speak to the fine tuning that occurred? So some of the changes, and I know that I think both you and Eliot talked about them a little bit, but just maybe give us some highlights on the commissioners, some of the debates that they had, and where they landed in terms of this current proposal.
Sure. I think the biggest one is actually what we were just talking about, where we were proposing these changes to happen. I think we really initially started with just having it be citywide. And I know I was more of a proponent of that idea, but as we have different approaches to things, we live in different districts, we have different, constituents that we're representing. And so we really came together to see, what would be a right size for this type of infill and this type of development. So we, kind of try to figure out, what metrics and what tools do we use to decide where we want to put this. And then we got from, a citywide thing, narrowed it down to try to get to like a 50-50 mid-scale, low scale, and then ultimately got to our final numbers that you see here, proposed low scale 62% and mid-scale about 38%. So that's a really good example of the fine tuning that has happened over the last six months to a year, as we really look at, we really went street by street in some instances as to where it would make sense to have infill and what type of infill that would be. Another one that we talked about that Eliot mentioned was the demolitions and the historic buildings, and making sure that in our proposal, we are making strong recommendations for the preservation of historic structures, and working with the Historic Preservation Commission to make sure that those things are in place. And then also adding affordability and displacement policies into this plan, because that's another thing that we've heard a lot of, making sure that we have tools in this plan to combat some of those negative side effects of infill. then of course the design policy. So right now, if I'm not mistaken, City of Tacoma doesn't have any design policy. So a lot of the projects that people are talking about, like on Reston or Proctor and things, like we're not really holding developers accountable to those type of design standards. So integrating design standards into this project is going to, moving forward, hold developers to that standard, and making sure that they're meeting the scale of a neighborhood, doing those setbacks, including trees on the property if they're demolishing or taking them out. I know as the Tacoma Housing Authority, we have to go through these things and look at how many trees are on the property. If we're taking them down, we need to put up additional trees and things like that. And so this plan is going to make it so that we're actually going to be holding developers a little bit more accountable. So that's something that, again, we built into this plan as we went through the last several months of hearing from people and tweaking this program.
Right. I just have to chime in and say that, yeah, design has been a big theme, not only with residential areas on the Home in Tacoma project, but just over the past several years. And, the city and the Planning Commission are working on a parallel effort called the Urban Design Studio. And there's a report that you can go find online that summarizes a whole range of actions, because the city just is growing faster than we used to be several years ago, if you go back a few years. And so with that comes more importance on design. So there's a package of recommendations in there to further strengthen our design standards in all kinds of ways. And then this Home in Tacoma project extends that more into our neighborhoods, whereas other work has been more on design for big buildings in centers and downtown. So
Great.
it is a big extension of our emphasis on design. Absolutely.
There are a number of questions concerning affordability and sort of the promise of affordability through this. But before we get to those, I think I have an easier question, which is a few comments concern repurposing of existing land, of commercial and industrial space, consideration of commercial district zones. How would these differ from some of the mid-scale, and wouldn't it be better just to have one sort of mid-density zone? So Eliot, could you talk about, sort of those the commercial zones, what the vision is for those, and thinking about, has the city been thinking about, and this may be a question for Jacques too, as part of the his affordability initiatives, has the city considered facilitating redevelopment of underutilized or vacant property in commercial zones as a complement or alternative to this proposal?
Yes. Yes, the idea of growing, especially downtown and in our centers, that's been, the foundation of our housing, or of our growth strategy for a long time, for a good number of years and decades now. And as any Tacoman knows, downtown is now growing, and other centers are starting to grow as well. So that's a long-standing pattern or strategy, because that's where we have the best transit service and other things that are important to live a walkable lifestyle, and as well as jobs and housing all in the same place. So in addition to that, we have corridors that right now, some of them are zoned commercial, and there's even some vacant land along some of those corridors. And so we are looking at that as a parallel strategy, not an alternative, which some folks might say, let's just grow there and not throughout the neighborhoods. I hear that, but the proposal is to do both, and that we need both. And so there are some strategies, for example, to extend some incentives to try and create some affordable housing along those corridors. So it's a both, is my answer.
So you would say that those are complementary, then it sounds like.
Yes.
So on to the affordable housing concerns. I'm just going to kind of take these one by one. The first question is about oversight and accountability for developers, and the acknowledgement that luxury developments so far have not been providing affordable housing. So it's part of a broader question of how will this proposal achieve affordability goals? So thinking about how developers might be held accountable to providing affordable housing through this proposal.
Absolutely. So um, it's true. As of now, we have mostly incentives. There are some incentives for developers to to integrate in some affordable housing into their larger projects. And there's one area of the city where that's actually a requirement. But through this proposal, as part of that phase 2, the city would be reviewing all those kind of affordability regulatory tools and coming up with ways to expand them, to maybe actually require affordable units in more cases, especially in places like downtown where growth is really happening and really kind of booming. And also especially in neighborhoods where growth is happening pretty quickly. So that is part of the answer as to how this would, how we could get some more affordability even in our larger projects through this effort.
And then there was another question about like some scenarios that were provided. So would this project, let's say a developer builds some mid-scale builds to mid-scale density, could you imagine a situation where only the affordable units are on the lower level? For example, or has the city thought about integration of those units within a development?
Great question. Don't fully know yet. There's a starting point to answer that question. The state has some guidelines and legislation about affordable housing incentives, and the units generally have to be at least functionally comparable to the for market units. So there's definitely, that would be the goal. It would be to have the units be functionally equivalent to to the market rate units. Beyond that, I'm not sure if we fully know yet.
And then this another example that was raised in form of a question that also might be part of the phase 2 consideration. But if a developer wanted to redevelop, if an owner wanted to redevelop into a mid-scale, would there be like a concept of they could rent, they would have commercial on the ground floor, and then they could rent some of the units above to potential workers or the business owners on that ground floor. Would that be a concept that this might accommodate?
Not exactly. So we're talking here about about residential zones. There's a little bit of a concept of maybe allowing some small office or retail in mid-scale, but it's still primarily residential. So in terms of that being said, in other locations, downtown centers, those commercial areas along corridors, there the answer would be yes. The idea could certainly be a mixed-use building where you'd have housing above retail or other commercial space. Do you think that answers?
Yeah, yep, absolutely. So there was a question under kind of this broad umbrella of how will this project ensure that how will it move the needle in terms of affordable housing? A question about the impacts of the ADU change. So from the pilot program to allowing ADUs throughout the city, what was the effect of that? And is there any returns on affordability yet from that change?
So well, the ADU change, which was adopted in 2019, and that change was to allow a detached accessory dwelling unit citywide, whereas before they had to be connected to the main house or attached to the main house. So since that change was adopted, there's been a pretty decent amount of interest, and as of now, over 200 ADUs are somewhere in the permit process. And that's certainly a lot more than we would have seen prior to the changes. So there's a lot of interest, but not a lot of data in terms of affordability. What I've heard kind of from just talking with developers and property owners who are working on ADUs, it's not cheap. It's expensive to build, and as of right now, the cost to build even if it's a small unit, it still costs like the same per square foot as if you were building a big house. And that means it's not automatically going to be affordable. So part of this effort as well is to try and look at ways to chip away at the cost of whether it's ADUs or some of these other housing types, and find ways to bring the cost down and create more opportunities for affordable housing to be built.
And then similarly, along those lines, I would characterize a lot of the comments as a concern that developers are going to make a lot of money, just make profit off of these changes. This could potentially impact lower to moderate income homeowners through raising their property taxes or displace renters. So, and this may also be part of phase 2, but so 2 questions. How does the city, and this is for anybody on the panel, how would the city respond to this concern that this would favor private developers over, actual people? Is the first question, and that may be some of the requirements that are added in phase 2.
So Eliot, I don't think that there are any preferences over developers who's developing what parts of pieces of land. And I'm glad that this question was brought up, because working with a government agency, the Housing Authority, we're a developer, right, of land here in the city. And thinking about the term developers, it has this kind of negative connotation of like people from Seattle or overseas or whoever coming in and buying up land and turning it into and profiting off our things. And the way that we frame the word developers, like, there are lots of people and agencies here in Tacoma that are developers that would, as a result of this plan, be able to build more affordable housing in more places, like the Tacoma Housing Authority, like nonprofits like Forterra and Mercy Housing, like churches like Shiloh Baptist Church up on the hilltop that's trying to turn some of their homes that they own into multi-family units. So I really want to kind of challenge this conception we have of developers, and recognize that we have developers here in our community that want to take these opportunities and turn them into positive outcomes for our residents. On top of people, like agencies like the Housing Authority, there are also small contracting companies, lots of that are owned by people of color that have experience doing DADUs and that have experience building ADUs on properties that can help neighbors to build those things, right? And then we're creating local jobs. We're investing in our local economy. We're supporting local Black-owned businesses. And so there are more opportunities for local developers to take advantage of this in this proposal than larger developers. Like, yes, that will happen. We're not going to say that that's not going to happen, but I think opening the doors to allow more people to develop in more areas is going to increase that diversity of housing types and the diversity of who's really considered a developer and who's actually doing these developments.
And so the second part of my question, either for Commissioner Torres or for Eliot, this also came up on Tuesday, was the concern about this activity resulting in higher property taxes and ways that may, and displacement in ways that may be mitigated as well. So has the city given that consideration, any consideration?
Property taxes, yeah, that's a great question. It's a conversation that we're having now with Pierce County, the folks that actually collect the tax. And our property taxes are based on, there's some state laws that govern them, and they go, they're based on the assessed value. And so they go, because our assessed values our properties are getting more expensive right now, our taxes are going up. But the county also, every year, they review the percentage, the levy rate that they charge, because they ultimately want to collect enough funds and not, more funds that are needed to fund the public programs that our community has voted into place or otherwise, put in place. So property taxes are already going up really quickly. The question here, I guess, is, would these changes cause that to really spike and accelerate? It's a great question. It's something that we need to look at and concentrate on. Our expectation is, and the theory of the case here, is that by making these changes across the city, throughout citywide, we would hope and expect to prevent a spike. Property taxes are already going up, but we think that by doing this at a citywide level, we're not going to cause a big spike in property taxes. It's a great question, and it's something that we hear very regularly about, because property owners at least, this is a fact of life, and nobody wants to see that their tax rates go through the roof.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's funny because I actually have my little card I get from my property, and that's been a concern for myself over the last several years. And it's funny because at the beginning of this process, we heard a lot of concern about infill actually causing property values to go down. So people were really concerned about that. And now we're kind of hearing the opposite, as people are concerned about property values going too high and not being able to afford that. And that's something we're really concentrating on, because we know that can lead to additional displacement, which would defeat the purpose of this project, because we're trying to avoid displacement. So as Eliot said, working with different groups, including the Housing Equity Task Force, which is a subdivision that is made up of Planning Commission members as well as Human Services Commission members, to address some of these things, and trying to come up with some policies that we can put in place to protect lower income homeowners. If their property taxes are too high and they can't afford them, what are some policies that we can put in place to protect those homeowners? Because that is a concern. So yeah, we're working on it on multiple different ways. Those things are set by Pierce County. So as Eliot said, working with Pierce County to see what possible interventions we can put in place there.
Great. So there's two areas where there've been quite a lot of activity in the Q&A. So a lot of folks would like to know: is there a map? Is there some way that I could see beyond what's in the proposal in the PDF or what was shown in the presentation tonight, where I can really distill what's going to happen adjacent to my current property, the property that I own, or in my neighborhood? Is there anywhere online, Eliot, where somebody could actually see that?
Yes, absolutely. If you have, so if you go to the homepage, cityoftacoma.org/Home in Tacoma, close to the top of the page, you'll see a link to the recommended housing growth scenarios map. And click on that, and it'll take you to an interactive map where you can see the whole city. You can type your address in or zoom in on the neighborhood that you want to look at. And then you can see not only the final map, but you actually can look at the other versions that the Planning Commission looked at. And you can see the factors that the commission considered, like the transit lines and the location of our centers and things like that. So tons of information that's there. If you have any questions, there's also information on that webpage of how to get help. You can send us an email or give us a call, and let us know how we can answer your questions or help you find what you're looking for there.
Great. And there was another couple of questions around how this proposal, or does this proposal, address the needs of persons experiencing homelessness or people with very low incomes. And I might turn that over to Commissioner Torres, because I know she probably works very closely through the Housing Authority with people at the 0 to 30% AMI. So is this a proposal that would address the needs of people experiencing homelessness or whom are extremely low income?
That's a great question. And I think there's not a real simple answer to that, but I think the simplest answer is that this policy doesn't directly address those lowest income individuals, or creating those lowest housing for those lowest incomes to the 0 to 30%. But I think, like I mentioned earlier, allowing more types of development in more areas will allow agencies like the Housing Authority to build those things. And that's where our expertise comes in, right? So places like the Housing Authority or other nonprofits or churches that are really going to be building to cater to those, we're going to be able to do that more under this policy. And Eliot, if you have any other kind of insights, I don't think this this doesn't really hit to that super low income thing. It's more of the moderate income. It's more to curb the continued rising of housing costs in our region.
Yeah, everything you said, I totally agree with Commissioner Torres. This will, like you said, this package does call for kind of giving a leg up to affordable housing providers, and that's something that the city can do. We can set our affordable housing incentives to be favorable, to give a leg up to affordable housing providers. So that's one thing we could do. We can also generate some income or some funding that we could hand to affordable housing providers.
And I did see a question earlier in here about the perceived lack of link or correlation between our current crisis around folks who are experiencing homelessness and affordable housing as it relates to this program, this policy. And I think that there is a really strong correlation between those, because a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness are experiencing that because there is a lack of affordable housing. They might have been displaced from something because of an increase in rent or increase in property taxes or things like that, and they are forced to become homeless. And it's getting increasingly difficult for people to exit homelessness because there aren't those affordable units available. At the Housing Authority, we have a wait list that's years and years long because we cannot keep up with the demand for affordable housing. And so I think those two things are linked, and we're trying to, and this isn't a silver bullet. This plan isn't going to solve all of those things. This is a tool that we can utilize right now to start working towards addressing those concerns and addressing this emergency that we're experiencing.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Torres. I know we are at time. I just want to, Eliot, could you walk folks through where the map is located on? Could you do that one more time, and I can actually put that in the chat for everyone. So it's this website here, the Home in Tacoma Project, and then where on that website is that map located? Could you give us a visual of that again?
Sure, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, Heidi. I actually just put that link in the chat for you.
Thank you. Mary, thank you so much. You're very fast, faster than I am, clearly. But last but not least, there are a couple of people who are concerned that they may be forced to sell their homes to developers under this proposal. As we're closing, Eliot, could you just speak to that concern, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up.
Yeah, that's something that we hear all the time. Absolutely not. Nothing here is there's no intention of anybody's house or any of that. This whole thing is just about creating additional opportunities, and then homeowners can choose to pursue them or not. But nobody is talking about taking your home. No bulldozers are going to be part of this proposal.
Right. So even if you see on a map that like your house is in, one of the shaded areas that are, kind of proposed for these changes to happen, it doesn't mean that we're going to come through and take single family housing away. It just means that you have the option. We have options now to put these different types of housing into the area. So it doesn't mean you're going to be forced to sell your house. It doesn't mean that your street is going to change completely. I know I live on South G over, on the east side, and I don't foresee any really changes except for me putting a DADU in my backyard because I'm trying to start that process. Those things wouldn't really happen. And I think that might be a misconception. It's like we're not forcing anything on anyone, or we're not saying that single family housing is not allowed. We're just making it so that there are more options for that plot of land. It might even be a vacant house and somebody can buy it and turn that into something else. We're just making those options more available.
Yeah, it's actually the opposite. Right now, the city is saying, no, you're not allowed. The only thing you can do is your house that's there now. And so instead, this is, stepping back a little bit, and not having the city impose that strict control over what property owners might choose to do.
Great. Well, on that note, thank you so much, everybody. There were, gosh, I think over 100 comments in the Q&A. Really appreciate your thoughtful comments. Those that contained more detail than we were able to address. I just want you all to know that the Q&A will be examined closely by city staff. And last but not least, invite you, as you're seeing on the screen here, to attend the public hearing with City Council next week. Your comments need to be submitted before 4 p.m. and that public hearing is through Zoom. It is not an in-person hearing. So thanks again, everyone, for your attendance, for all of your thoughtful input, and we hope to, or the city staff hope to see you next week.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Thanks, Heidi. Thanks, Commissioner Torres and Jacques.
Thanks.